Welcome back to the Wednesday Extravaganza SportsLine here on NewsChannel 5+. Jon Burton, my co-host, Christian Torres, all of 10 years old, well-dressed. He's hanging out with me on the show tonight, and we've already had a viewer call in and talk about how well-dressed and how well-spoken you were. How about that? You got a fan already.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Well, it's so exciting to have you here, and I know your dad's here. Who else? Who do you want to give your shout-outs to? You can look right in that red light and talk to whoever you want.
Well, first, my mom and granddad, I know they're watching. Shout out to you guys.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Granddad. How y'all doing?
Yeah, my parents have taught me really well. My granddad has taught me life lessons, and great people, absolutely great. And my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
That's right.
He's the one who brings us here. He's the one who has a plan for every person's life. So He's my Lord and Savior, and He created us for a purpose, and my purpose was to be on the show.
That's right. It was destiny, no question about it. All right, you ready to talk some Preds?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's bring in our good buddy from NHL.com who covers the Predators, Robbie Stanley. Robbie, how are you, man?
I'm doing great. I don't know what you need me for when you've got Christian there.
I was going to say, top that, pal. Top that. Good luck with that, man. This guy is killing it tonight, man.
I'm not even going to try to top that. There's no way I can.
All right, Robbie. Preds get the win over the Red Wings last night. You know what? Before we get into that, what has happened to the Detroit Red Wings? This team was perennial powerhouse for so long, all the great players, and they've struggled the last couple of years. Is it a matter of just their good guys getting old, salary cap? What do you see when you look at Detroit?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Some of their better players in the past have either gotten old or they've already retired. Henrik Zetterberg's still there playing at a high level, but there's some bad contracts on that team as well. You take a look at Justin Abdelkader's contract, Danny DeKeyser. There's a lot of pieces there that makes it difficult to kind of fill the rest of the roster there. So they're going through a bit of a transition period in Detroit. They missed the playoffs last year for the first time in I think like 25 years.
Yeah, like forever.
So it was an unbelievable streak they were able to put together. But there's no question that it's kind of a transition period for the Red Wings right now. I still think they're probably 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 years away from getting back to the point where they were. Because like you said, JB, I mean, there was the entire existence of the Predators franchise up until about 3 or 4 years ago. The Detroit Red Wings were almost the standard of the entire league. So no question they're not the same team now as they used to be.
Yeah, no question about it. We're talking with Robbie Stanley from NHL.com. All right. Listen, a lot of people were getting a little uneasy about the way the Predators were playing, a couple of tough home losses back-to-back. I'm not going to say they needed this win last night, but they certainly could use the win that they got last night. You agree?
Oh, I agree 100%. And I think when you take a look at how they've been playing for the past 2 weeks, up until that Ottawa game the other night, I think they were pretty unhappy with how they had played. And, it started to catch up to them a little bit in the loss column. And I think even before that, on the road trip where they got a point at least in every single game, they really didn't play all that well. And I think that sometimes that's the sign of a good team, when you're able to struggle and you still come away with points and come away with wins. But there's no question they needed to find a way to get their game back, and they've started to do that in the last couple games. Even last night against Detroit, I thought in the second period they weren't very good.
Right.
That I'm sure has to do with the back-to-back they were on. You play the night before, and then you're right back at it again the next night on the road after you traveled. So I'm sure that had something to do with it. But they're starting to get back to the point where they were right around the All-Star break, where they seem to be clicking on all cylinders.
Robbie, you bring up a good point. They did have that successful road trip, but they were living dangerously, getting off the slow starts and having to play catch-up. And I think we all felt eventually that was going to catch up to them, and it kind of did in those games we talked about, right?
It absolutely did. And I think that's really the first time all season long the Predators have had to deal with that. For the most part, they've been pretty consistently good all year long. And I think when you take a look at that road trip, that's kind of where it started to go off the rails a little bit for them. Mm-hmm. Amazingly, they were able to continue to get points, but it finally caught up to them. Just not a very good effort against Calgary last week when they came here. They weren't happy with that game at all. And then they started to get a little bit better against Detroit, but even then didn't come out with the same fire that we've seen from them all season long. So it seems like they're getting back to that point now. Interested to see how this next week goes for them, because you're looking at a couple potential changes. You could add somebody at the trade deadline. And also, Mike Fisher is going to be coming back pretty soon as well. So I'm interested to see what kind of boost that could give them when Fisher does decide to come back in the lineup.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about both those points individually. We're talking with Robbie Stanley from NHL.com, talking Preds here on SportsLine. Let's start with the trade deadline. You know, I think we know David Poile, the general manager, well enough to know that he's not going to make a trade for the sake of making a trade. If he truly thinks that making a trade is going to help this hockey club, he's going to go ahead and do it. So I think there's a trust factor there. With that being said, what do you think he could be looking for, and maybe some names that might be linked to the Preds via trade?
Yeah, I think he's looking for some depth at forward from a scoring winger standpoint. I think we saw last year in the playoffs how important depth is once the playoffs come around. Last year they lose Ryan Johansson, they lose Kevin Fiala, and they had guys like Colton Sisson step up and do a pretty admirable job, but it's still not the same as having your top guys in there. So I think if push comes to shove, David Poile is going to be looking for another veteran forward that can put the puck in the back of the net. I don't think he's in a position where he has to overpay, reach out and really go after everything at all costs, because there's a couple options they have. We just talked about Fisher coming back, but there's another option. A guy named Eli Tolvanen, who's a first-round pick of theirs a year ago.
He's killing it at the Olympics, right?
Killing it at the Olympics, yeah. He played extremely well, lit up the KHL, which is the Continental Hockey League over in Russia and Europe. And he's played really well all season long. But the problem with that is, I mean, he starts his playoffs in the KHL in the next few days, and he could be done as early as like March the 7th or 8th. Goes all the way, he could be done in late April, and at that point the Predators are already in the playoffs, so you don't know when his season's going to end. That's the only risk that comes along with bringing Tolvanen over. So I think if the price is right, maybe guys like Rick Nash, maybe a guy like Mike Hoffman from Ottawa, rumored to be in on some guys from Detroit as well, Thomas Tatar and Gustav Nyquist. So there's some options that are going to be there. The problem David Poile had when we talked to him last week is the prices right now are just a little too high for his liking. And like I said before, he's not in a position where he's going to overpay and go out and do anything just for the sake of doing something. I think if the Predators enter the playoffs right now and this is the team they have, I think they're comfortable in doing so.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, Robbie. I'm sure the price tags are pretty high, because I'm sure a lot of these teams are going to say, all right, well, give us one of those core 4 defensemen, and we know Poile is not going to give up one of those guys.
Yeah, there's no way he's going to trade one of those 4 defensemen, and nor should he. I mean, if you take a look at the playoffs last year, I think that's probably the #1 reason why they were able to advance as far as they were, because that top 4 defense, PK Subban, Roman Josi, Matthias Ekholm, Ryan Ellis, they present matchup problems for teams like no other team in this league does. And it's kind of a weapon that really separates the Predators from most other teams in the league, in my opinion. So I think those guys, if they're wanting those guys back in return, that's a non-starter. I don't even think David Poile would entertain that thought. Same thing with Eli Tolvanen. I'm sure there's a lot of teams that are going to want to ask Tolvanen in a trade to come back their way. And unless it's a guy that's just a superstar proven forward in this league, I don't think there's any way David Poile does that either. So at that point, your options start to become limited, because you have a first-round pick available that you can trade away. But if things go well and things go to plan for the Predators, that first-round pick is going to be pretty low. So it doesn't have the same value as a traditional first-round pick would perhaps if it was in the lottery or something like that. So if you're not going to trade away Tolvanen and you're not going to trade away one of those 4 defensemen, I think your options after that point become a little limited if you're David Poile.
All right, Robbie, what about Mike Fisher? He said all the right things when he announced he was coming back, that he'll play wherever. He doesn't care what line he's on. That being said, this guy, you know, was the captain of the team that went to the Stanley Cup final last year. Obviously, he's here to provide depth and hopefully go on the ride all the way to the Cup final again, and hopefully, you know, we can see the Predators win it. What do you see Fisher's role? How do you see him fitting in with this team?
I think he's going to be a guy that plays on the 4th line. I think he'll center the 4th line, and he won't be that active and won't be used that much at even strength, I don't think. Where they're really going to utilize Mike Fisher is on special teams. So he'll be out there killing penalties. He's been really good at that throughout the course of his career. And I think they're at least going to give him a look on the power play. I know their power play for the most part all year long has been pretty good, but Fisher showed last year that he can be a guy that stands in front of the net, wreaks havoc for opposing goaltenders. He tips pucks, he causes screens, all that stuff. So I think that probably the biggest impact you're going to notice Mike Fisher in is when he's playing special teams. But I do think when he's the 4th line center and he's probably playing, you know, anywhere from 10 to 12 minutes per night, He's a guy that can really be a shutdown player defensively. They're not going to ask him to do that much offensively 5-on-5.
Right.
I think his main responsibility is going to be shutting other teams down from a defensive standpoint, and he's really, really good at that.
Robbie, last question. We'll get you out of here on this one. Preds fans, what's the one thing that they should be concerned about with this team as we kind of get through the regular season here and get ready for the playoffs?
Yeah, I think if you take a look at some of their underlying numbers, 5-on-5, they're not generating as much offensively as they probably should be. I think that's starting to turn around a little bit because you've got Ryan Ellis back in the lineup now. You've got that top line of Forsberg, Johansson, and Arvidsson. They're starting to come together. They're starting to click. So I think in a month from now, their numbers could look a little bit different than they do right now. But if you take a look at some of their underlying numbers, I think that's why David Poile is interested in potentially adding another piece. Because 5-on-5, their scoring chances, while they haven't been terrible at it, I still think there's some room for improvement there. So if your power play runs dry like it did the last week and a half, 2 weeks before they started to click again in the last couple games, you start to struggle to score goals if you're not generating much 5-on-5. So that's the only thing I would really be concerned about. I like their depth defensively. I still like their depth for the most part at the forward group. And Pecorine and UC Saros have been pretty good and pretty consistent all season long. So there's not a whole lot of weaknesses on this Predators team. The 5-on-5 scoring chances, I think, would be the #1 concern if I were a Predators fan.
All right, Robbie, great stuff. Get your plugs in. Where can people keep up with you?
Yeah, you can keep up with me at NHL.com. I'm at rstanleyNHL on Twitter, and you can hear me on this fine program. Usually I'm a lot better than this, but Christian kind of stole my thunder tonight. So.
He certainly did, man. He's stealing my thunder. I mean, I don't know if you're near a TV right now. You should see how well he's dressed. He's got the vested suit on. He's ready. He looks like a banker.
Put this to shame.
Robbie, thanks so much, man. We'll talk to you soon, all right?
All right, thanks for having me, guys.
All right, that's great. Robbie Stanley from NHL.com. Some good stuff. He's well-versed when it comes to the Preds,
yes,
right?
Sir. Mike Fisher coming back, I think, is a great thing for the Preds. I think it's going to help them a lot moving forward into the playoffs and forward to the Stanley Cup.
He adds that leadership, right? He's a been there, done that guy, right?
Yeah.
And his wife is really pretty. Did you know that?
No, I did not. I haven't researched that.
Okay. No, you bring up a good point. You know, having a guy like Mike Fisher back, even if he's on a fourth line, just what he can add to that locker room, right? Just, you know, you're a football player. You know about leadership, good coaches, you know, your senior players stepping up and kind of getting everybody going. Mike Fisher can be that guy for the Preds, right?
Right. I think with the contribution of other players, I think he can be a great asset that Peter Laviolette and, you know, that he can use to bring this team forward and move them forward and go to the next thing in store for the Preds.
Yeah, it'd be nice. You're going to be at the parade if we bring the cup home? I better see you there. You know, you might be broadcasting with us on live. All right, we're going to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk to my good buddy, the King of the Mountain, Jeff Jarrett, WWE newly inducted Hall of Fame. We're going to talk some pro wrestling with Double J next. Stay with us right here on SportsLine.